Hi, this is a video about medicalization. We're going to be talking about medical stuff. Some medical stuff is gross, and if you have an issue with gross medical stuff, this might not be the video for you. Thanks. Hi everyone, it's Allie from Ok2BeFat. I'm back. Today, I am coming to you to make a video about medicalization, which, if you've read the title, I guess you already know. There has been a lot of discussion recently on Twitter, and I guess probably the rest of the internet, but Twitter's kind of my jam, about the concept of transmedicalism. People have kind of discussed what that means in the context of trans people and the trans community, in that transmedicalists are generally understood to be people who view transness through the lens of the medical system. And these are often trans people themselves. They view what is to them, and parentheses, not to me, but to them, what is considered legitimate transness has to do with what is considered legitimate transness by the medical field. So this would involve access to medical procedures and other forms of medical intervention, and that those procedures and medicines must be accessed and utilized in order to consider a trans person a real trans person. There's been a lot of talk about why this is harmful. It's pretty harmful. People don't have access. It's gatekeeping-y. You're not fooling anybody into being on your side by throwing other people under the bus. But what I wanted to talk about, rather than the trans community part of the term transmedicalism, is the medicalism part. So what is medicalization? Let's talk about it. So before we get started, I'm just going to take my phone and I'm going to read to you the definition of medicalization from wikipedia.org. So medicalization is the process by which human conditions and problems come to be defined and treated as medical conditions, and thus become the subject of medical study, diagnosis, prevention, or treatment. Medicalism and medicalization is not a thing that is exclusive to trans people. It is the process by which something is brought into medicine. There was a point where we were pre-modern medicine as we know it now, and then there were, a transitional period, and then there's currently modern medicine as we know it today. And which parts of yourself or diseases or what's considered a disease, these things have changed over time. Is medicalization always bad? No. I'll give you an example of a medicalization that's actually good. So before the introduction and adoption of germ theory, the theory was Miasma Theory, which is basically that diseases were caused by bad smells. This sounds ridiculous to us today because, we understand germ theory and accept it. Barring the ability to actually have a microscope and actually see bacteria and viruses and understand, study and understand their processes, people really didn't know how certain illnesses were caused. This is also during a time where indoor plumbing was not really a thing in a lot of major large cities like London. People were dumping sewage into the Thames, and not just in London but in a lot of places, and so there was a problem of very, very bad smells due to poop. I don't know what else to say, but yeah, you're dumping poop into the river. Some people had cows that they had lifted up to the rafters of in the attic of where they were living, and then they would just throw the cow poop into the basement, which is not good sanitary procedure. And so in those kinds of instances, there's a lot of illnesses that are caused by exposure to poop, and the bad smell is not a cause, but it kind of goes along with the issues that are caused by unsanitary waste disposal. That's the word. Issues that are caused by unsanitary and unclean waste disposal, which has been a huge problem for all of pre-modern human history. Those issues cause bad smells, and they also cause disease. But if you can't see the germs, then you don't know that it's not the smell that's causing the disease. So it wasn't as ridiculous as it seems. So a good version of medicalization is a version of, okay, so we know that this illness, I don't want to pick one because I'm not 100% sure on bacteria or viruses, but let's say cholera. So cholera is caused by a bacteria or a virus that has to do with not doing your poop disposal properly. I am saying poop way more times than I wanted to in this video. In understanding that it was the bacteria or virus that caused cholera or the bubonic plague or typhoid fever, all these diseases, polio, smallpox, and then developing, you know, vaccines and antibiotics to treat the bacteria and the viruses that cause these diseases, then the prevalence of those diseases is greatly reduced in the population. That's an instance of a thing that is bad, which is, you know, dying from cholera or the bubonic plague, which you don't want, and having the medical community understand what's causing the plague that you have, and then working to not only treat, but also prevent, treat through vaccines and antibiotics, but also prevent through sanitary waste disposal. Yay, medical stuff, right? So that's an example of medicalization that's super positive. We had a thing that was causing problems, the thing was brought into the medical world, and then the problems were solved. That's pretty simple, but that's kind of what we're talking about. So usually when we're talking about medicalization, especially now in the, you know, this is 2020, in the modern age, we are not talking about it in a positive manner, because the problem that has happened is that most of the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, your choleras, your polios, your smallpoxes, these things, you know, tuberculosis, that were causing massive amounts of death in the, you know, 1800s prior to the invention of antibiotics, the adoption of germ theory, the invention of certain vaccines. These things were massively causing lots of mortality and lots of people dying. So once you take care of the one cause, one outcome, kind of low-hanging fruit illnesses, the things that can be solved by sanitation, then you're sort of left with chronic illnesses, things that have multifactorial or like multiple causes to deal with, and then those issues are very complex. And so they can't be solved in the same way that don't drink poop water, don't get cholera is kind of a solvable issue. So you're left with issues that are a lot more complicated. And so now when we talk about medicalization, we're more talking about issues of the medical field taking something that may or may not be a problem, applying the same problem medical lens to it, and then causing pretty severe negative outcomes for patients and for society. In some instances, sometimes there's mixed outcomes. Another example of medicalization is the medicalization of birth and obstetrics. Birth and obstetrics. The medical having a baby. Doctors as a thing wasn't always a thing. The profession of being a doctor wasn't the same thing that we consider it to be now, like always. There's always been people who have tended to sick people, but it's not been professionalized in the way that being a doctor or being a nurse is currently professionalized. That was a thing that had to transition and happen. So the field of being a doctor was very heavily male. It was very heavily male to the point where they wouldn't even allow women into medical schools. I'm using women and men here kind of to mean cis men and cis women, although who does and doesn't have uteruses doesn't map onto that exactly, and I hope that we all know that. But the terminology of the day. There was a point where most people, when they gave birth, would do that with the assistance of a midwife. This is not exactly my field. I've read a little bit on it, but it was a long time ago. But I'm sure there's somebody who this is their total field, because the taking over of having a baby from being something that happened at home, you know, a woman with another woman there who was sort of directing the procedure, was taken from that sphere and moved into a medical sphere. What's the name of that damn book? Caliban and the Witch by Federici talks about this time period. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I did watch a Philosophy Tube video about it. I will link that below. The procedure of having a baby was taken from one sphere and medicalized and pulled into another. Birth is dangerous and has always been dangerous. It's less dangerous now than it used to be. Mortality rates from giving birth before the modern age were quite bad, but they got worse when obstetrics was medicalized. There's always been this problem, but then when the doctors came and took it over, the death rates actually got quite a bit worse. Now, why would that happen? Now when we hear about home births, we think danger. But in the time where it was becoming medicalized, that was prior to the understanding of germ theory. And so what was happening was doctors were doing autopsies and getting all kinds of things and germs and God knows what on their hands. And then they would go from that without washing their hands, because nobody really did that then because we didn't know about germs. And then they would go deliver a baby, which involves putting hands places, and a lot of times it involves open wounds. Try not to be real gross, but I'm doing the best that I can. Middle class women at a certain period were going to the hospital giving birth and had huge high rates of mortality. What they call crib bed fever or birth fever, I forget exactly what it's called, but basically it was like sepsis, where you have blood poisoning because a doctor did an autopsy and then took his hand that he didn't wash and it went places and you got an infection and then you died. And that was a real big problem. The poor people who couldn't afford to go to the hospital had much lower rates of death. We know about germ theory now, and we consider it normal for people to give birth in a hospital. The gynecological and obstetrics field is still not very central to the concerns of the people who have the uteruses. It seems in a lot of cases that these things are still very heavily dominated by people who have little to no concern about the pain or experiences of the person who is actually giving birth. I have read horror stories about ways that people have been treated in the hospital when they have given birth. People have ended up severely traumatized by the way that they've been treated by doctors. And so the medicalization of birth is mixed. Because when it first started, it was quite bad, because the intervention of doctors to take something out of a sphere and bring it into their sphere, when it first started, resulted in extremely high levels of death. And then now it's a lot better than that, because at least we know we're supposed to wash our hands. You know, don't touch a corpse and then go deliver a baby without washing your hands. That fucking article will haunt me forever. Now we consider it a lot safer for someone to give birth in the hospital because there is access to, you know, surgical teams. C-sections are considered pretty common. Emergency births are much better dealt with than they used to be dealt with in the past. So in a sort of perfect scenario, the intervention of the medical field is quite good because there are people who are walking around who wouldn't be here if it wasn't for C-sections and ICUs for tiny babies and incubators and all these things that we have now. But on the other hand, things don't always go perfectly. Some people are not listened to. The story about Serena Williams and the blood clots is a real illustration of this problem, that the process of giving birth in some cases is almost considered not to include the person who is doing the giving birth part, and that in some cases some medical professionals treat the concerns and pain and hey, can you please help me of those patients as nuisances to be gotten through and gotten rid of, and ignoring those patients is not just traumatic for them, it can also be deadly. People can die. This is kind of a situation where it's good, but it also has some bad factors. Now, in what cases is medicalization kind of just totally bad? Fat people, for one. Most fat people will tell you that the medicalization of body size has not been great for us. A lot of people don't know this, but I have to use the slur here because that's what they use, but obesity was not always considered a disease. It was actually only turned into a disease by the ADA in 2013. That's not that long ago. As was pointed out at the time by dissenters within the ADA and by fat activists, the simple fact of having a larger body does not present the definition of a disease. There's not really anything about being bigger than another person that necessarily means that you're definitely going to have a problem, except for the problems that, you know, the medical field causes. A lot of the problems that fat people are having are actually caused by the medicalization of our size. The fact that doctors will not listen to us and will not help us. The discrimination that is proposed on, you know, health grounds. These are all things that are huge problems for us. Being fat it's not a disease. It doesn't present a disease profile. Let's pick something. If you have chicken pox, that's an illness. It has symptoms. It has a cause. It goes away. It goes into your spinal cord fluid and then causes shingles. Thanks, chicken pox. But you can see the disease process that is chicken pox. What's the disease process of being larger than another person? There isn't one. Now you may say, and I'm sure you're typing it right now, well, but being fat causes blah, blah, blah. Does it though? That's not really what the studies show, and you can go back into my fat activism basics and see that for yourself. The correlations that we see, and they are correlations, not proven causation. The correlations that we see for fatness and some diseases are either overblown or they are being treated in a different way than the correlations between other things that are not stigmatized. The correlations between diseases, legitimate diseases like diabetes, heart disease, cancer. You gotta give it to people when they're like, being fat causes cancer. Yeah, because cancer is like just one thing. Like we can just say, it's one thing. No, it isn't. Anyway, the correlations that we see, they're treated very differently in the scientific literature, in that when we don't see correlations, or when we see that being fat actually brings better outcomes, our scientists won't accept that, and neither will our medical field. They call it a paradox, and then they just say, well, just lose weight anyway. Like, that's possible. There's not been any proven study that shows that major weight loss is possible over an extended period of time for the majority of people. That is an actual scientific fact. I think the thing is that when we talk about these correlations, they are not being treated the same as correlations for things about a person that aren't stigmatized. So very fair people have a higher rate potentially of skin cancer. Okay, that's not really being stigmatized. There's a correlation between being smaller and Crohn's disease. That's not being stigmatized. You know, because you wouldn't be like, everyone eat a lot of food and get super fat so you don't get Crohn's disease. That wouldn't make any sense now, would it? Being very tall can give people heart problems. What are they supposed to do about that? It's not that the correlations should be ignored. It's that when the correlations are stigmatized, that the way that they are treated is in a stigmatizing way. Before we talk about transmedicalism, let me read you some books. So I brought books. It's gonna be fun. I got a book club. I do books. So medicalization it's not really how we're used to thinking about healthcare, but we do need to think about it more. And so I have books. I'm gonna read you some books so that you'll know that I didn't just make this up and that I got this from books, which is where I get everything. Before we go into the books, the other form of medicalization that I wanted to talk about, you know, and this is a big one that most people do know about, and it's being gay. The identityness of queerness. That's my preference. As a bisexual person, I prefer queer, so I'm just gonna say queer. The stigmatization of queerness allowed homosexuality to be brought into the medical sphere and treated as a disease. And this was, I believe, originally done for the same reason as the people who are like, oh, well, if we just call obesity a disease, then people will be like, it's not your fault, and they'll stop treating fat people bad. Medicalization has never once ever worked that way. Like, maybe a little bit for alcoholism, but even there, not really. And it doesn't really work that way for most kinds of addiction, so you're not really helping us. being queer was brought into this medical world with this idea that it was going to make the stigmatization better, and it didn't. It made it worse, and it led to horrific ex-gay therapies that are still legal in most parts of this country, which is horrendous, and it has not made anyone's life better. It was rightly celebrated when homosexuality was removed from the DSM as a mental illness, because calling a natural human variation a mental illness is stigmatizing. Now let's read books. Are you ready? I'm gonna start with Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia by Serena Williams. I'm actually not taking a lot from this book. Number one, I'm not finished with it. This is the one I'm currently reading, but I super recommend this. This book is amazing. It's super duper well written, and it fills in a timeline in a really beautiful way. It is mostly about, so far as what I am up to, which is about here, it's about beauty standards, and fat phobia sort of originated and then it became the thing that it is today. Sabrina Strings does, in the introduction, make a reference to Foucault, and unfortunately, I've not had a chance to read my Foucault. Whoops. I'm gonna get to it, jeez. But at any rate, I'm gonna read you this part about Foucault. According to Foucault, medicine intervenes as a key institution of the 20th century, providing information on how to live for health and longevity. Its dictates inform what Foucault calls the biopolitics of health management, which include disciplinary practices that one must perform to be considered a healthy and thereby good citizen. Why is that important? Well, the reason why it's important is because what do we mean when we mean health? The discussion of health is a discussion that comes with framing. The discussion of like discipline, basically there are certain social structures that are used to control people. And in a fat activist reading of Foucault, you will see his references to health and social discipline used to explain the ways that stigma works to control people, but also the ways that health is a thing that has been defined, and it is not a natural law. It is a thing that is defined by a society, and that different societies in different times have had different definitions, and that it's important to understand that health is not gravity. Health is something that we as human beings have made up as a concept, because if we don't understand that health is not something that we can assume a definition for without questioning it, then we can't deal with the ways that the definition of health is used to control people. So that's why the Foucault is important, and that's why I'm definitely going to get to it. This is Limits to Medicine, Medical Nemesis, The Expropriation of Health by Ivan Illich. When you want to talk about medicalization, this is the shit. This is where we go. This is where we start. This is like the book. I have dog-eared the shit out of this book. It's got a lot of great stuff in it. The other thing I wanted to say about this, I mean, it's not really that important, but it was amusing to me, is some of the things in his footnotes are hilarious and so just unbelievably bitch-faced in a way that I think is so fucking funny. And I am just a sucker for funny footnotes. Also, what I consider to be funny footnotes, I mean, they're not like, it's not like ha ha, a laugh riot, but you know, it's a little bit like, yes indeed, I see what you've done there. So let's look at the Illich. I have some post-its and we're gonna go. Health, after all, is simply an everyday word that is used to designate the intensity with which individuals cope with their internal states and their environmental conditions. In Homo sapiens, healthy is an adjective that qualifies ethical and political actions. In part, at least, the health of a population depends on the way in which political actions condition the milieu and create those circumstances that favor self-reliance, autonomy, and dignity for all, particularly the weaker. In consequence, health levels will be at their optimum when the environment brings out autonomous, personal, responsible coping ability. Illich's definition of health is different than the social definition of health that we've come to understand, which is pretty fashy, I gotta say. It's like, I don't know, fashy, but it can be, but it's like, are you the most productive worker you can be? Are you ready to be prepared to fight for your country? And it's just like, whoa, I didn't agree to that. I'm not gonna do that at all. But like the most healthy people are people who can perform athletic feats, or people who are able to do a giant amount of work without having to have rest or benefits or healthcare. You know, things that capitalist society doesn't want to provide us with. Things that we need as human beings, but the definition of health that we are dealing with currently is not a definition for human beings. It's a definition for corporations and capitalism. We also have a very militaristic, especially in the United States, definition of what health is, because like every couple of years, some fucking ding-dong general goes on TV and is like, the readiness of the military is bad, because fat people exist. And it's just like, buddy, you got that much money and you guys still aren't ready to go? That seems like a you problem, not a me as a fat person problem. Also, I don't like you, so less of you would be great in my opinion. But my opinion as a like, hey, let's wind this military shit way the fuck down, maybe all the way down. That's not the societal opinion. So because we are in such a militaristic imperial country, then the health of people is considered to be how much they can contribute to the accumulation of capital and whether or not they are, I guess, bodily able to go be in the military. And that's a massively limited and pretty fucked up version of what health is supposed to be, as opposed to the Illich definition, which is how individuals cope with their internal states and their environmental conditions. Which, that's got a lot of room for a lot of different ways to deal with individual people's bodies and priorities and lives. And I like that definition a lot better. Here's another piece from Illich. During the last generations, the medical monopoly over healthcare has expanded without checks and has encroached on our liberty with regard to our own bodies. Society has transferred to physicians the exclusive right to determine what constitutes sickness, who is or might become sick, and what shall be done to such people. Deviance is now legitimate only when it merits and ultimately justifies medical interpretation and intervention. Don't get hung up on the word deviance there. He means deviance from the mean. So people who are not average or considered the norm. So what's Illich saying here? That the medicalization, the taking over of more and more parts of human beings' lives and putting them under the rubric of the medical field has left us in a place where we do not have the body autonomy that we should. We don't own ourselves and our own bodies in the way that we should. Doctors have more power than they should. The doctors have the power to tell patients that they can and can't do things that I don't believe doctors should have the power to do. This is the issue with transmedicalism because there's so much gatekeeping, and especially if a trans person is fat, that the gatekeeping involved in being trans and then the gatekeeping that already exists involved in being fat come together and explodingly multiply each other to the point where people are in some pretty like horrifically gatekeeping scenarios, and then they cannot get access to the care that they need and deserve because doctors will not allow it. That's not okay. I believe that the right to transition care is a human right, and that if someone asks for transition care, that they should not be made to jump through hoops, that care should be provided to them, because what they are asking for is help in doing something that they're allowed to do, which is alter their own body for themselves because their body is theirs. So the gatekeeping of trans people from being able to access transition care is wrong, and it's a violation of their human rights. And if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. All right, so let's get back to the Illich. I definitely recommend this book. I would say it's a bit of a tough read. It's pretty jargony. It's academic-y in a way that makes it a little bit difficult to get through. And it's also like originally from the 70s, so it's got some language that we don't use anymore. So, you know, keep that in mind, but I don't think that's a reason to not use it because it's got a lot of good points to make. So we'll just kind of work around that, update it where we need to. Each society has its characteristic nosology. Nosology?
Nosology.
Nosology, not nosology. All right.
Nosology.
Gotcha. Nosology is the branch of medical science dealing with the classification of diseases. I had to do a lot of like writing down my own definitions in this book because he was just like, learn it, bitch, or don't. But I mean, it's an older style. Each society has its characteristic nosology or classification of diseases. He does define it. I'm sorry, Ivan, I slandered you. Both the extent of conditions classified as disease and the numbers and kinds of diseases listed change with history. The official or medical nosology recognized in a society can be, to a very high degree, out of gear with the perception of disease shared by one or several of society's classes. This is from Birth of a Clinic, and it's in a footnote. In our society, nosology, so like who gets to say what are and aren't diseases, is almost totally medicalized. Ill health that is not labeled by a physician is written off as either malingering, which is pretending, or an illusion. The question of who gets to decide is always an important question, and the basis on which these things are decided is also important. Any society to be stable needs certified deviants. People who look strange or who behave oddly are subversive until their common traits have been formally named and their startling behavior slotted into a recognized pigeonhole. By being assigned a name and a role, eerie, upsetting freaks can be tamed, becoming predictable exceptions who can be pampered, avoided, repressed, or expelled. I think I'm gonna name myself an eerie, upsetting freak, haha. What Alicia's saying here is that the labeling of certain traits and characteristics of human behavior as diseases, which are then treated as immoral, is a form of, once again, societal control. And so people who are upsetting the social fabric can be tamed by being pulled into a medical realm and treated as if their existence is a disease. Now, is that pleasant and good for those people? No, not really, but society already doesn't like those people, so it doesn't care. I wanted to say too, it's wild the things that aren't medicalized, right? So in the beginning of the 20th century, like around it's like Eisenhower times, there was a rise in heart attacks, and at that point it was thought that it was only really happening to these like powerful, super stressed out white CEO guys, you know, cis men, and that like, oh no, all our powerful daddies are being struck down in the prime of their daddiness with heart disease, and we must do something. But you know what didn't happen? No one medicalized or stigmatized the presidency or the state of being a CEO. No one was like, oh, these white guys gotta give up some of their enormous power because it's giving them heart attacks. No, medicalization never works that way. It's only like, oh, these marginalized people are doing a thing that we don't like, or they're making us uncomfortable, so let us call their existence a disease. That's not good. Now I'm going into Seeking the Straight and Narrow. Seeking the Straight and Narrow, Weight Loss and Sexual Reorientation in Evangelical America. It's by Lynn Gerber. It's really good. I am eternally mad that I didn't get to use this title because it's so brilliant. This book's especially interesting in that it looks at weight loss groups in evangelical context and also ex-gay therapy and support groups in an evangelical Christian context. I thought it was an interesting compare and contrast of medicalization that has been rolled back from one group but not from another, and also the ways in which these types of medicalization are rolled up with morality. Although the conflation of disease and immorality has a long history in the Christian tradition, the normalizing power of the medical has been in ascendance since the end of the 19th century. Advances in medical knowledge, demonstrated effectiveness in the treatment and prevention of infectious disease, and the consolidation of the medical profession combined to strengthen the social authority of doctors, researchers, and other medical professionals. This is what I was talking about with the birth example. The declining influence of religion created space for other moral/moralizing authorities to fill, and medicine stepped in, addressing a range of issues once understood solely in moral terms, like sin, like homosexuality, are now understood from a medicalized perspective. An important source of medicine's normative power has been its disavowal of the moral through an appeal to science. science. The medical model and the associated medical designations, right, Peter Conrad and Joseph Schneider, are assumed to have a scientific basis and thus are treated as if they were morally neutral. They are not considered moral judgments, but rational, scientifically verifiable conditions. The symbolic appeal to science as its sole arbiter has produced a social misrecognition of medicine's moralizing role. What is Gerber saying here? What she's saying is appeals to science as the arbiter of what is okay to be medicalized, which groups it is okay to use the medical system to discriminate against. That those appeals are moral appeals. They are appeals to what is normal, or they're appeals to what is morally good, and that those appeals are hidden by an overt appeal to science, which is considered to be a non-moral, non-judgmental third-party arbiter. But here's the problem. While science is kind of the best way that we have to know things over time, the over time is a real kicker in that thought process, because science is done by people, and so science has the problems that any group of people have. Scientists are affected by prejudice. Scientists are susceptible to capitalist appeals, to the funding that they need to do their jobs. I talked in the video about the death statistics about regulatory capture, and this is an instance where regulatory capture is still a really big problem. There is a huge amount of regulatory capture in especially studies about nutrition and studies about weight. We've also seen that studies into trans people and trans kids are being funded and publicized in certain ways that are not always the most honest. There have been dishonest studies. There have been studies that did not say the things that people in the newspapers say that they say. And so that's a problem for trans people. It's a problem for fat people as well. You know, there's the reproducibility, the ability to reproduce scientific studies. So you should be able to take a scientific study, do it again, and get the same results. But there's not a lot of money or prestige in redoing someone else's study. So we're getting a lot of screamy headlines off of studies that haven't really been retested or redone. Or maybe they involve 2 people. I saw one that was 1 person. And people were putting out like, oh, well, you can't do this for the entire human race because of this one lady. Okay, that's not really doing a science, y'all. I mean, you gotta do better than that. So the issue is that we don't see the arbitration and the moral calculus that goes into who is doing the science, how is the science being done, what people are involved in it, what are their, not biases, I'm starting to hate that word, but what are their cost benefit analysis, like what are they getting out of it, what are they involved in. Scientists who've made their entire careers off of a certain proposition, generally, as most human beings are not really gonna be that accepting of like troubling the thing that they built their whole career on. That's just human nature. The acceptance of germ theory was kind of dependent on all the people who believed in miasma theory dying out. And sometimes that's how we move forward in science, is that the people who believe the wrong thing just get really old and die. That's not how you want to necessarily base what you're treating human beings, individual human beings on. You would have a much better moral and ethical grounds to come at medicine from a perspective that medicine is a service. It's not a god issuing demands to the servants who have to scuttle off and carry them out, and like the servants are the patients. Like, that's a wild way to think of medicine, but it seems like that's the way that a lot of people do think about it. Just the entire concept of non-compliant patients is pretty grotesque, because if a doctor puts down non-compliant in your chart, good luck with that. Good luck getting help, because you're gonna be in trouble. Why shouldn't a patient be able to be non-compliant? It's their body, and if they don't want to do what a doctor tells them to do. They should be allowed to do that, whether or not you or I think it's right, because in the end, it's their life and it's their body. I believe putting, if it would be possible to do this, putting medicine on a service status and not having it be like, oh, the gods on high have delivered us down the message, and that also grounding it in body autonomy and the autonomy of individual patients being the most important thing. And some doctors do that, but a lot of them don't. And the ones that don't hurt their patients. And that's wrong. A lot of times people will just be like, well, doctors say, well, scientists say, and it's just like, that's not a neutral statement. For one thing, there just aren't any neutral statements. Like the things that people just are like, this is definitionally neutral. No, it isn't. There's always a framing. And that's really, really, really important to keep in mind. Back to the book. Medicalization as a discourse has not only generated power and authority for medical professionals, and woo boy howdy has it ever, but has also provided some marginalized groups with strategies for ameliorating stigma. It means making stigma not as bad. The rise of medical authority shaped what sociologist Talcott Parsons called the sick role, a social script where stigmatized people claim illness rather than moral failing as the cause of their condition. Playing the role well alleviates some of stigmatization's harshest social effects, providing a morally blameless understanding of the condition's cause. Some groups have attempted to reframe their condition in medical terms in order to reap these effects. But as the case of homosexuality shows, this strategy is always risky. Entering into a medicalized discourse may provide some protections, but it can also introduce new threats. And this is incredibly important when we come back to and talk about transmedicalists, because why would people agree to be medicalized? I mean, it's for the same reason that a lot of fat people agree very loudly and vociferously that being fat is bad, and, you know, oh, it's so bad that some fat people call themselves obese, which is awful. That saying I am the problem, it alleviates some, definitely not all, but it alleviates some of the worst effects of the stigma. If you are willing to say, I'm fat, but I know that it's bad, and I'm definitely trying to lose weight because I know that it's awful, and look at those terrible fat activists over there, they're so terrible, then you're engaged in a project of protecting yourself as much as you can. But it is also a project that involves harming other fat people, and it's bullshit and it's not ethical. It's sort of similar, but lesser in degree, with people who are like, well, I'm fat, but I'm healthy. And it's like, okay, but like some fat people aren't healthy, so what about them? The issue of trying to shield yourself from some of this stigma by pushing it onto other people is that it doesn't even really work, because whatever benefit you're getting is conditional and can be removed at any time, like the cool girl, right? I say this as a former cool girl myself. It's a racket. It doesn't fucking work. You can be as cool as you want, but the instant you disagree with the guys you're being cool with, then you're just as much of a bitch as those other bitches. You can only be cool as long as you're willing to take what people want to dish out to you and never complain. So you can be an okay fat person as long as you're absolutely willing to take every single bit of fat phobia and make it be your fault. And as you never complain and never ask people to stop. Well, I don't want to live like that, and I think it's wrong. The same thing kind of we're going along with the Blair Whites of the world and the transmedicalists, where it's like, I've got mine, so fuck everybody else. The problem with transmedicalists, self-hating fat people, with, you know, the Blair Whites and the Calvin, whatever his name is that the people are responding to a real experience of stigma by taking that stigma and externalizing it onto other people to protect themselves and to shift as much of that stigma and the consequences for the stigma onto other people, and to justify doing that because those people are wrong or they're bad. They don't have a diagnosis, or they could just do the weight loss like I'm doing again. The problem with that is like, you know, it's not ethical for one thing, but also it doesn't work. It's not gonna stop the stigmatization. It's not going to end the problem of fat phobia. It's not going to end the problem problem of transphobia. It's not going to get you where you would hopefully want to go, which is to a place where you can be the person that you are without other people getting all up in your business and hurting you for no reason. Transmedicalism is an attempt at justification. It is saying, I am real because I have this diagnosis. But it's not the diagnosis that makes you real. It's the reality of you. And there are always going to be people who don't believe you. And you can say DSM, DSM as much as you want. And that's not going to get you where you want to go. And you're hurting other people. And that sucks. That's a real shitty way to behave. And you can't love yourself out of the stigma and discrimination that medicalization represents. Medicalization is discrimination. It is gatekeeping. It is doctors being moral arbiters. It is jumping through hoops to prove yourself to somebody, to have access to things that other people just get access to without having to jump through those hoops. And that's not fair, and it's not right. Trans people need to access transition care, and they shouldn't be prevented from doing that. And fat people need to access medical care, full stop. And they shouldn't be prevented from accessing that either. And the fact that doctors, in a lot of cases, have set themselves up as priests of health, and that we don't even as a society see that construction. And it is constructed. That is a massive problem that needs to change. I got one more book. This is The Death of Humane Medicine and the Rise of Coercive Healthism by Peter Skarabagnik. I don't know if I would necessarily recommend that people run out and buy this. It's out of print, so copies are quite expensive. Most of the ground that's covered here is also covered in the Illich, which is available for a lot less. But there's some good stuff in here, and coercive healthism is a really good phrase for where we are. Health, like love, beauty, or happiness, is a metaphysical concept which eludes all attempts at objectivization. Healthy people do not think of health unless they are hypochondriacs, which strictly speaking is not a sign of health. Similarly, when our organs perform their functions perfectly, we are not aware of them. It is the absence of health that gives rise to dreaming about health, just as the real meaning of freedom is only experienced in prison. The pursuit of health is a symptom of unhealth. When this pursuit is no longer a personal yearning, but part of the state's ideology, healthism for short, it becomes a symptom of political sickness. Extreme versions of healthism provide a justification for racism, segregation, and eugenic control, since healthy means patriotic, pure, while unhealthy equals foreign and polluted. He goes on to say, in the version of healthism encountered in Western democracies, the state goes beyond education and information on matters of health and uses propaganda and various forms of coercion to establish norms of a healthy lifestyle for all. The reason why I wanted to pull this is because we do see coercive measures coming down from the American government and in other countries. There was just a bill in South Dakota this week to make puberty blockers for trans teens illegal. That is coercive. The BMI charts are coercive. Workplace wellness programs that mostly target fat people and smokers are coercive. Do we have the right to form our own version of health in the society and the societal governments that we live in? I would say no, we don't really. I also wanted to point out, I haven't done this yet, just the fact that there are forms of becoming ill and injured that are glamorized, like sports. We never ever hear people talk about the cost of sports injuries. How much does it cost to have high school athletes be injured and then have injury problems into their adulthoods? How much cost does it cost to have skiing accidents? How much does it cost for people to blow their knees out running marathons? No one calculates that because being an athlete and being involved in sports is considered a sign of health. Whether or not the pursuit of sports actually results in a body that is free from pain and injury, which in many cases it doesn't. not. But we have decided as a society that we want to include athletics and sports as definitionally healthy. And so we don't consider the injuries and problems that the pursuit of sports causes to be unhealthy. We don't consider them to be problems that need to be solved. And that is another thing to consider when you consider that health is a construction. It is a thing that we have decided on a definition of and then forgotten that we'd made that decision. And that's something that we have to remember. I got one more. One of the justifications for governmental intervention in people's lives is that it is in their own interest, though they may not realize this as they are foolish, stupid, or irresponsible. This argument is difficult to refute if those who have power to coerce others to change their ways also have a monopoly of defining what is foolish, stupid, or irresponsible. And there you have it. Who gets to decide? Who gets to decide what is a reasonable intervention into a body? Who gets to decide what I can or can't do with my own body? Who gets to decide that a version of chronic pain caused by a sports injury, an injury caused by a car accident, those are acceptable injuries. Those are things that we do not consider problems in need of solving. But we do consider the existence of trans teenagers to be a problem so dangerous that we have to read about it in the newspaper all the time, and that people won't allow them to make decisions. And you may say, well, they're minors, but minor children are still people who deserve to have a say. And puberty blockers are reversible. Puberty blockers are absolutely responsible medical care because it gives a minor child space and time to make a decision. And if the argument is that, well, they can't make decisions because they're minors, okay, let's give them some extra time. That is all that puberty blockers do. They give them extra time. The use of puberty blockers is absolutely correlated with less suicides for trans teens. Apparently, we don't care about that as a society. Transness is the problem, but not the thing that is going to cause people to not be so devastated that they end up killing themselves. That's not allowed because that doesn't solve the problem. But the problem is that people exist and they're not going away. This construction of health is absolutely 100% ridiculous. If you poke at it even slightly, it doesn't make any damn sense. Well, are we gonna let people make these irreversible decisions? There's a tattoo parlor on every fucking corner. You can go get a real ding-dong tattoo and no one can stop you if you're over 18 because you're an adult. But if I want to get my tubes tied and be surgically sterilized, a doctor can tell me no. Why? Why should that be allowed? It's my body. If I want that, I should be able to get it. And I shouldn't have to jump through hoops. And it's not right. People shouldn't have to jump through hoops just to get medical care because they are fat and because they're bigger. There's no reason for it. The reason for it is that we have made decisions about what is and isn't moral, and then we have decided to hide those decisions and never talk about them because we've put them outside of the frame. Well, it's time to reopen the frame and bring those decisions back into discussion to say what is truly moral, because that's what we're talking about here. We are talking about morality, a discussion where the only moral answer is that people own their own individual bodies and have to be allowed to make decisions that impact them in their lives without being prevented from doing so by powerful authority figures. That's the only moral answer. But we're having a discussion of morality without being honest that that's what we're doing because people want to call it science, like science is morally neutral. And I got some news for you about the history of science if you think that's true, and the history of the medical field. So that's all I've got for you on medicalization. I hope you liked it, and if you did, you can subscribe, you can thumbs up. If you didn't like it, you don't need to do anything. Please like and subscribe. I said that already. What else do people say? I don't know, smash the bell and get all the notifications so you can see all my videos. And you can talk to me on Twitter if you want to. This is Allie. I'm okay to be fat, and it is okay to be fat, and that's it. Bye!